Good morning, everybody. My name is Valeria Lopez Fadul, and I am an assistant professor of history and Latin American studies at Wesleyan University, and I am also an assistant editor of History and Theory. And I'm really excited to be having the privilege to moderate this panel this morning. And I think that this panel will connect in really nice ways, both to the discussion that came before, especially to the Q&A. Because both authors or both contributors to the special issue debated in their articles through different ways, but interrelated ways, of how the digital condition allows for new ways of understanding, visualizing, which was really important, conveying and teaching, especially the processes that go into creating historical work. So I'll introduce both contributors now. So Jesse Torgerson received his BA from Biola University and both his MA and PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. His teaching and research interests are in the medieval period with a specialty in the East Roman Byzantine Empire, animated by exchanges and interactions between the societies and cultures of Europe and the Mediterranean basin, and in particular by the creation and transfer of historical knowledge. His just completed book project recreates the dramatic mid-9th century political context surrounding the re-editing of a famous Byzantine history of the universe, the Chronographia of George the Synkelos and Theophanes. Along with Gary Shaw and Adam Franklin Leon, he manages the Travelers Lab at Wesleyan University, which provides undergraduates with opportunities to collaborate on historical research projects related to questions of space and movement in the medieval period through a range of analog and digital methods. The title of his paper today is Historical Data, Publish or Perish. Silke Schwant is a full professor of digital humanities at Bielefeld University. Her research interests lie in the field of digital history, the digitization of practices in the humanities, and the teaching of data literacy skills in the humanities. She also works on late medieval English legal history and conceptual history. Schwant studied history, Latin, and theology in Bielefeld and received her PhD from Goethe University Frankfurt in 2010 with a thesis on the semantics of virtus in the political language of the Middle Ages. Her more recent publication focused on the use of modeling and digital visualizations in history and the challenges of dealing with uncertainty in research scenarios and the digital society. One of her current projects, which she will discuss today, and I hope I pronounced this correctly, is the VR project eTARDIS, entitled Exploration of Temporal and Spatial Data in Immersive Scenarios. The title of her paper is Going Virtual: How does the potential of interactive scenarios influence the way we do history in the 21st century? So, Jesse, if you want to take it away.
Ooh, this is dangerous. There's 2 water bottles here. That's mine. Okay, it's a little bit precarious here. And of course now the scroll is not going to work. There we go. Okay, cool. So thank you so much for being here, to the organizers, to the editors, to my co-panelist, Professor Schwant, who we seem to continue to collaborate intentionally and not. So this is always fun. I'm really excited to hear what Silke has to say. I apologize for this is going to be a slightly kind of the flow of it may come across as a little bit extemporaneous. I sort of wanted to take into account everything that was going on yesterday, so I've tried to do that as much as possible. I also have like a bunch more things that I want to try and say from what was already said this morning to tie things in. I think that's I'm being a little bit ambitious with that, so maybe that'll come up in the Q&A. But this has been really productive for my thinking already. So thank you to everyone for your thoughts. Okay, I'm going to start the timer and try to force myself to keep to it. So, publish your data or perish the profession. In 2012, I presented a chapter from my dissertation at a workshop. The first question I received was a two-part question. The first part was, who is your dissertation advisor? Not sure from the tone of the speaker if my answer would result in praise or condemnation of my Dr. Mutter, I hesitated for a second. And into that second was uttered the second question, which was really more of a comment. Because what you are doing is essentially a critical edition. No one in history gets a job for a critical edition, let alone getting a job on a critical edition project. No one is going to tenure you if your first project is a critical edition. Who is your advisor and what are they thinking? So we can all sit here and do some combination of gasping and chuckling, thank you. But here's the thing, that commenter was speaking out loud the reality in this discipline and profession, which all of you, yes, you and you and you and you and you and you, the reality which all of us continue to uphold, perpetuate, validate, and enforce. Publishing the data of our historical work is not enough for our profession. A decade later, it is still the same. I would still get the same comment if I were a graduate student doing the same project. A decade later, I can sit in a library committee meeting on digital publications, and a pre-tenure faculty member, excited by the possibilities of their research as a digital project, utters that they are now thinking of making their first major project a digital project, and before you can blink, a dean and a former dean have jumped in to say, no, 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 you do that after tenure. Here is where we are and where we will be until we change ourselves and our recalcitrant, unimaginative, conservative, fearful, retrograde way of thinking about what it is we do. Publish your data or perish the profession. In the next 15 minutes, I'm going to offer a mindset for that change. The article that I published in the theme issue tried to make an intervention, but perhaps I was too evasive about the intervention I was trying to make. I workshopped my article from the theme issue with some of my students to try this out, and their first question was, why does what I am trying to say, you, professor, even need to be said? Can you please just tell them that? So I will try to answer that question by bringing the implications of my modest methodological proposal around to the question of teaching and publication. To do so, I start and end with historical practice, which I will continue to insist is the only thing we historians should be theorizing about right now. A good friend who is an economist, and his research is primarily in marketing, likes to joke to me that the rejoinder he gets most often at conferences is, yes, that works in practice, but does it work in theory? Historical theorizing must work in the opposite direction. If our theories do not make any sense of the actual practices we do, then they might be criticism, they might be philosophy, they might even be an intervention, but they are not historical. Historical theory must be applicable to historical practice. So, my argument builds on you accepting a distinction between, one, the historical source material, which drawing on Joanna Drucker's work I called our CAPTA, two, what we historians do with that source material, which I called creating data, and then three, the creation of facts and then narratives, or as Stephen would say, arguments and perhaps the narratives out of that material. So in order to make the case for these distinctions and then to argue for what I think is the implications and possibilities of our acceptance of them, I'm going to provide a different version of the argument I made in the article by moving backwards from the last step to the first, quickly reframe our work, and then reconstruct the practice of history on these terms, beginning with teaching as the equipping of each student with the practice of history, and that's it. Publish your data or perish the profession. So, the deconstruction. Both Stephen and Gary's papers yesterday alluded to, I think, a helpful starting point. We've perhaps been befuddled by thinking that narrative is part of the distinctly historical. For if the medium is the message, then digital history must mean that we have new narrative forms, and so discovering what they are must be extremely urgent, right? Or we're going to not understand our own profession. But maybe actually not, if we take, I think, what Stephen and Gary were saying seriously, right? Stephen's emphasized it is a particular kind of, not a particular kind of narrative that is maybe the most important or unique thing that historians produce, but particular kinds of argument. And Gary has pointed out that social history has never really been interested in narrative so much as the bits of history. So let me make this point in yet another way. By show of hands, how many of you historians in the room have published what you would honestly call an actual narrative history? Okay. How many of us would view the publication of such a narrative history as our ultimate vocational goal as historians? How many of you want to get there one day? Okay, so my goal is also not to publish narrative history. I do not think in terms of the creation of narrative history. I do not teach in order for my students to reproduce my narrative history, nor to produce their own narrative histories. I don't have a problem with narrative history as such, but they're simply not the point of what I'm doing. What I've learned to do through my years as a student, what I just did in my tenure book, what that entire 400+ page monograph was all about, and what I will mostly do for the rest of my publishing and working career is to establish some new historical arguments or facts out of a whole lot of historical bits that I had either discovered myself or reassembled or reread from the bits that others had created. What I do is make historical arguments from source material by first making the bits to which Gary referred, or the bits that I call data in my article. That's what I do. I make those. Now, I'm assuming you're all still with me, that the situation I've just described feels pretty generally familiar and comfortable and true to what you do. But what I'm accusing us of not emphasizing in either publication or in teaching is that we don't start with those bits. We make them. Those historical bits, that historical data, is what is the result of our historical poiesis. Dwell each and every day you work as a historian with the act that is prior to the historical data that we all work with. Whether we define ourselves as ultimately analog or digital practitioners, and this is the argument of my article, does not matter. We're all doing this. That historical poiesis depends on our prior action. That action is, and this is the key, the authorship of the source. It was in this context that in my article I relied on a slight adaptation of Johanna Drucker's idea of capta, things that are seized or taken. Sources are not given. Sources are made. We make them. Nothing is a source by its nature on anything else. A tree does not need to tell us about its seed. A carcass does not need to tell us about a death. A pot does not need to tell us about its former contents. And a text does not need to tell us about its provenance. Nothing needs to be a source on anything else. Practitioners of history, whether professionally minted with a PhD or not, begin historical investigation by exerting an auctoritas, an authority to be the auctor, the author, the creator, who defines an object, any object, right, as a source on something. We, in our, an unscrewed top in this case, so we in our capacity as historians need everything to be a source on something. And we premodernists, of course, generally make everything a source on just about everything else. We make a tree into a source on its genesis and the conditions of its development. We make a carcass into a source on the demise of a living being. We make an old empty pot into a source on trade. And we make a text into a source on just about every kind of social condition imaginable. It is as a result of this authorial action to define the archive, the authoring of objects as sources on any specific investigation we might imagine, it is through this that we make it possible to then create the data or the bits of historical argumentation. So that is my deconstruction of the historical method. Now, in quick reverse, my reconstruction, my plea to you to reconceptualize ourselves from teaching on up through publication, lest we continue to devolve into self-defeating misconceptions, confusion, and disciplinary paralysis. Publish your data or perish the profession. I begin here by referring back to Stefan's evocation of Sam Weinberg. Our pedagogy is to inscribe historical thinking in our students. Teaching inheres in everything we do, and that's my name. I am first a professor. I profateor or profiteor. I profess, I declare publicly, I confess, I teach. Every year I teach, and I know depending on your institution, this number will probably seem very small, but I teach between 70 and 120 students. I can require each of those students to listen to me for 40 hours. I'm not convinced 120 people will read any of my publications in any year. There certainly won't be 120 people who spend 40 hours in a given year with my written work. What should I do with the precious time I have with the actual audience of my historical practice? I think I should, without a question, teach them how to practice history, and hopefully you agree, but neither of us think that what I mean by that is that if I teach my students to do history, I teach them how to write historia, the narrative text that we call histories, right? That is not what I'm interested in doing. We must teach from the point to which I just led you, with the stuff of history, its objects, and teach exactly what and how we do history out of the material which we name source, to practice history, historien, to do the work of historical investigation, to author objects as sources, to turn objects into sources on some particular subject or question in a responsible manner, right? That is our claim as historians, that we are authorized to do that. We then should teach our students to create the bits, the data of history, out of those things they have authored as sources on something, and to insist to them that activity is sufficiently worthy of the name of history. That's already history. Historians hide, we do, from our audience, our students, and even each other, our actual work. And this is not an outlandish claim, right? We hide our actual work with objects, spaces, and texts in the spreadsheets hidden on our laptops. All the objects we historians use are first translated, meaning we carry their powers over from an uninterpretable, untranslatable residue of the past, a trace, into a coherent present cultural context, right? As Shahzad was pointing out, we flatten in order to make intelligible. This translation is the creation of data until we then accumulate an archive of that data. What I am arguing is that we should shift our attention to valuing the creation of those archives of data by not only making their creation the first thing we teach our students, but by publishing them as such. Publish your data or perish the profession. Here's why I've made this long, slow, deliberate argument about historical practice and teaching in the context of the question of digital history as potentially a new form of thinking, argument, and ultimately publication. I've done so because we're not going to invent a new narrative form. Even if we come up with a fully anti-narrative narrativity for a new history, for a new human millennium, it's still going to be familiar because we don't have a fundamentally new means of reading as a mode of comprehension. Let us step away from narrative and narrativity as the end of history. Let us instead accept the profession of bits, the publication of data, as our ultimate vocational contribution. If we do that, we can change everything. Here's my list. First, the practice of history, which is the criteria on which each of us should be judged as historians, is in the authorship of sources and the creation of data from those sources, period. Or to stick to Drucker's terms, to author or seize capta and deduce data, or the givens of an argument, period. If we were to write standards for graduation, hiring, promotion, and tenure, which should be distinct things, specifically upon the production of historical data, thereby focusing our standards of evaluation more acutely on the practice of history rather than the production via imitation of a certain style of prose analysis, historians would be assessing our own historical work on historical terms that we all understand. Second, by sticking to the publication of data on its own terms, we stick to what we actually do well. None of us, and I am sorry, you are maybe all secretly great storytellers, none of us are narrators worthy of the name. We need to collectively confess that narrative history, the construction of this ideal monograph that we've all striven for, that will both be deeply analytical and somehow compelling to read, is not what we are trying or want to do. What we do really excellently, professionally well, is to turn wild varieties of objects, places, and texts, source materials, into comparable and commensurate bits into the data of subsequent historical argumentation. Third, by valorizing the publication of data as the primary end of our work, we make that work the obvious and naturally end goal for our primarily undergraduate and even high school students in this case, and this would be an outstanding public good. Students who know how to produce good historical bits and data know how to and will critique historical arguments by looking at the data behind those arguments. To paraphrase Mark Bloch, how do you know what you just said to be the case? Why can you be persuaded that this is true? If that becomes the point of historical education, and here I'm really just repeating Sam Weinberg, right? We will all be serving the world better. This skill set is as priceless as false information is in plenty. Fourth, by emphasizing how the publication of data really and truly is the doing of history, we can open up the honor and validation that still obtains to the work of history to many, many public practitioners. And here Laura made this point earlier, to identify through Stephen's proposed process of publication subsequent peer or professional review, publicly produced data that is worthy of the name of historical while still saving for ourselves an infinity of sources that are too difficult for any armchair public historian to sift through, right? And here I'm addressing the sort of perception, if we just open this up, then like, what do we have? Don't worry, right? We can open up the work of history while still maintaining the unique value that we already accord to the sort of research that a Byzantinist can produce from a trove of medieval manuscripts, documents, site plans, and coins. I have plenty to do. Fifth, and for me this is the most important change, this is liberatory. Our understanding of the past will not be changed through new narratives, but through avalanches of new data and newly conceived data. As we've already heard, that doesn't need to necessarily mean new evidence or new source materials. New data can be derived from previously exhausted source material. And that is exactly what I did in my own book. Every single item I examined was already known and studied. By publishing and then celebrating, highlighting, and reviewing newly created data, we make possible new pasts. This change also allows us to validate the presently uncelebrated and devalued work of creating new historical data that does not coherently fit into any current status quo narratives. Since historical data right now is not valued as historical work in its own terms, and remains in obscurity in private spreadsheets, the detritus of apparently failed research, dissertations, and books, just because its significance is not immediately manifest in the narratives we already accept. Finally, we will be in tune with our age. And here again, I'm echoing a point of Laura's earlier. In this digital history moment, what is on offer is not digital history. What is on offer is a new form of publication and dissemination, but not because of new ways of publishing narratives, but new ways of publishing historical data. And I would actually be interested in interrogating some of the examples Shahzad brought up as actually sort of archives rather than narratives, even though there, of course, is narrative and argumentation embedded in. There's a ludic quality to curated and explained data that not only appeals to a public beyond the professional historian, but across disciplines. Economists can toy with and incorporate good historical data in their arguments. Computer scientists can repurpose our data sets for what their methods can make of the messy data of history. I've had colleagues do this, and it's really fun. Many colleagues in neighboring disciplines such as English, area studies, film, art, language, to name a few, are in fact deeply engaged in the production of good historical data from carefully analyzed source materials. These colleagues can be recognized as doing history because they are. When we publish our data in forms that provide even the most basic visualizations and interactivity, we draw those on the margins of academic history into the work of developing arguments and stories from that historical data. Last few sentences. Publish your data or perish the profession. What I take to be the cost of not changing is in my title, drawing, of course, on the publish or perish adage. I hope the idea that unless we identify the part of what we do that is properly the creation of data as a distinct act and a distinct outcome, and unless we start to publish those creations as such, we will write ourselves out of the picture. To make these changes, we simply need to do three things. Focus our teaching on historical practices rather than historical narratives. Facilitate platforms for the publication of rich and articulated historical data, rewrite expectations and archive it, rewrite expectations for graduation, hiring, tenure, and promotion around the production of that data. That's it. None of these changes are particularly difficult, either conceptually, logistically, or in terms of the complexity of action. They are difficult because they are changes in culture. Thank you.
So hello, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. I've been excited for sort of the last couple of hours today and also yesterday to be part of this great crowd of people and share with you some thoughts on how we could, should, or already maybe did change some of our practices and some of our ideas in the digital realm. So first of all, thank you, Jesse, for your talk that basically kind of is a great opening, I think, to what I will try to show you now. Because you, as many before you, emphasized the question that, you know, what is actually changing when we do digital history? And in the piece that I wrote for the digital history and theory panel, kind of try to make the point that it's not changing as much as it is highlighting our practices and opening the black boxes of the way that we used to do history. And what I'm showing you today is I'm going virtual now. So I'm going to take you into a virtual reality application that is basically the most out of the box project that I have designed so far. And it came from the idea that what is digital history? And I'm picking up on something that Ethan Kleinberg said yesterday in his introduction. Do we need the label digital history? And what is sort of the characteristic of that kind of digital that actually sort of sets us apart from other historians? And while my title was what you can see on the slide now, going virtual, and then how does the potential of interactive, very long question, I actually wanted to change that into a much shorter subtitle, going virtual, doing history under the digital condition. Because I kind of buy the argument that, you know, from the history of digital humanities, there was this movement, and I think, Stephen, you also pointed to that yesterday, that we all kind of came together in this new digital realm from all kinds of humanities disciplines. And now we're starting to move back. So the post that I have at Bielefeld University is now digital history in the history department. So the digital is sort of going back into the actual disciplines to sort of make an influence maybe there rather than trying to be separate and trying to be something else. So we've been talking about these questions of doing history under the digital condition already a little bit. When we started to talk about data and the points that Laura made this morning, and also what Jesse picked up on. So what makes history, or what makes history under the digital condition different? One point I think that we already made in a very specific way. And we also do this, and then what we do with data is lots of visualizations. And this is going back to the question of Stephen Robertson this morning, when you asked, so what about the visual part of digital media? And maybe what I'm showing you today will also bring us back to that question, because it's all about visualization, as you can already see in the background here. So this is basically the entrance hall to our little workshop on how to do history, or how to reflect on data and the perspectives that are embedded in the way that data is presented. So the project was designed coming from the general idea that history practices is modeling practices as well. And if you think about databases and spreadsheets and all the kinds of things that Laura pointed out to us earlier as already historical work, then this is basically the point that I'm trying to make. So we are modeling our data in a certain way to answer certain historical questions. And then we present these data sets often in visualizations. And these visualizations are based on data that represent a certain perspective. So this is the modeling part. They are oriented on knowledge orders and models. So the things that we think that we know sort of structure these models that we then represent in visualizations. They reveal and the fact that they are models that reveals the limits of one's own perspective, or that's what we should actually learn from these data sets. And they develop productive potential through interactivity and manipulability. And this is basically why I'm moving into the virtual realm now. So I'm going to take you on the journey of this project for just a few slides. This is not going to take long. This goes back to Gary's paper yesterday, when you showed us this nice, in German it's Zettelkasten, and we have a very important sociologist in Bielefeld who has this huge Zettelkasten with lots of sort of cards and ideas and the like. This is the representation of the picture of one of these cards that was written in 1951, as you can see maybe up here in the right-hand corner, and it belongs to a project called the Synchronoptic World Atlas, done by a geographer and historian named Arno Peters in the 50s and 60s. And the idea was to collect lots of historical data and to create a book in the 50s and 60s that would represent the historical facts and events of a century on one sort of double page of the book. The digital version of this looks kind of like this. So you can see here, this is a German project. So I'm going to sort of try to sort of guide you through what you can see. So what you can see here, up here is it's in the, so this slide shows you the 20th century. And in the middle, you have lots of contemporaries. So lots of people with their dates, with their birth dates and death dates, so how, you know, their period of life, basically, to get an idea of contemporaneity and the, you know, the people that would have lived at the same time. And these little boxes down here and up here in green and then in orange and yellow represent historical events. And if this were the interactive visualization that was on CD-ROM, because it's published in the 1990s, you could click on it and then you'd get information on that particular historical event, and also on the different relations that these events have to each other and also have to these people. So this is, I think, an interactive, synchronous view of the 20th century. And the digital version, or the general version of this atlas, went from, I think, it encompasses about 5,000 years. So it goes from 3000 BC up until the 20th century. And this is one of the visualizations that kind of still follows the logic of the page, right? So this is very two-dimensional. They have other visualizations represented, and this is another example. So you can look at one historical event represented here in the middle, and then see the relation to other events and other people and events from different categories, because the colors here also represent categories. So this is economics, and then you know, the history of ideas, more or less, and then you have politics and revolutions and wars. So they try to kind of represent what we would maybe now call a knowledge graph in a kind of three-dimensional way, although of course this is still sort of on the flat screen, so it's not three-dimensional really. And I saw this, and my idea was, okay, so what I think that this does is it highlights the perspectiveness. I don't even know if this is a correct word, but the sort of that we are all bound to the perspective of the storyteller or of the observer when we look at the data and the historical events. And I think that this is one of the things that I concentrate in teaching as well. Teaching was one of the points that we keep on, you know, talking about. How do we actually tell other people that history should be done? And Jesse, you sort of gave me some keywords in your talk as well. So if this is one of the things that people should learn about history, that it is always told from a specific perspective, why not make this interactive and immersive? So that's why we designed a virtual space with lots of data points. So if this is historical data points imagined in the 1950s and 60s, this might be our data universe of today, right? So there's lots of possible nodes for knowledge networks. They are not very sorted. So what do we do? Where do we start? And how do we arrive at something that might rather look like this, where I can actually see nodes and edges, more like a network kind of visualization. And what happens when I move now, when I go, around in the space and I grab the nodes that I want to see and that I want to study. So how do I kind of realize this in a interactive way? These are just random visualizations that we kind of picked up, and we arrived at this very, this is a visualization from the Prometheus movie. I don't know if you know the franchise of Alien, and then there's Prometheus. So this is sort of it's sort of a visualization of space, and you see this one little man here looking at this huge amount of stars and connections and relations and all that kind of thing. So this is basically, this is how do we visualize knowledge graphs or networks of knowledge or sort of modern types of knowledge? There's lots of ideas about that already. And then how do we turn this into an interactive scenario? And the last thing I want to do with you now, and I hope I still have some minutes to do that, is show you a video of our prototype VR application. I will not say lots of things while you go through that little video. It's like 2.5 minutes long. But it is a prototype, so it doesn't look as nice as it can look. It's not filled with all the kinds of data that we could have filled it already. So this is just the state-of-the-art prototype that we designed. But the idea is that you start in an office space, really. That was the image that you saw on my first slide. And then you move around this office space. You have different kinds of ways to visualize and to select data. And then you go into a open space where you interact with the knowledge graphs that we have for this prototype taken from Wikipedia, from one possible representation of modern knowledge that kind of follows the same logic. Maybe a hypertext knowledge, maybe a logic, but a logic of connected items, basically. And we're working on implementing historical data sets afterwards. But for the prototype, we worked with the Wikipedia data. So maybe this sort of as an interaction to this kind of project. And I think that it highlights, well, maybe I say this after you watch the video. So this is the video. And I hope this is going to work now, but I have to change my presentation because I cannot be in the video at the same time, unfortunately. So we have to go to this, and then we go here, and then we should start the video. So this is the starting point where you can select language. This is kind of the menu. You always have also information on your drumsticks, what you can do, where you can move. This is the idea to also visualize the data geographically. So if you go, for example, for the data set of the 100 Years' War, then the different events and people would be visualized on this map. And you can sort of select the data sets that you want to see in different ways in these different kinds of menus. And now you're in our little visualization space. And what usually happens is you start on one of these nodes, and then you just have a look at your surroundings. And you can now explore the temporal and spatial data that we extracted from the data sets that we have. So we are now presently on the UNESCO node, as you can also see down below, where it kind of tracks your movements. And now from here, you can select different presets. One, for example, is the information on the 100 Years' War, because I'm a medievalist, of course, so I also selected like a historical case study. Now you have different possibilities to select the relation that is represented by the size and the distances between the nodes. So you can either say, I'm in the middle, so, the distance from the middle can be temporal, it can be spatial, and it can be semantic. So these are the three categories of distances that we are implementing. And with these very kind of technical menus, you can sort of choose the way that you want to that the distances sort of relate to each other. And here you can see now that we have a context menu for each node where you find more information on the historical event or the historical person. So we have text, image, video. We're working on visualizing this in a different way now. And what happened just now was you moved to another node, right? So now you look at the different people involved or close to the UNESCO node, and then you can always go back and forth. And the colors also kind of represent something like the different categories that we started off in the digital version of the Peters. So what we tried to do with this application is, or what my idea was, is answering to what I call the digital condition in the way that I pick the medium that I work in. So take seriously the things that are sort of present at the moment. I was frozen, wasn't I? So I wanted to take the digital condition seriously by picking a virtual reality medium and interacting with the kinds of media that are, I think, important to interact with also as historians. And I think that Marnie in her paper yesterday gave us very clear ideas why it is important as historians to actually interact with all these kinds of digital media, but also digital agents that are present in our current society. And I wanted to create a space where research can be, where people can sort of physically and personally learn what the construction of historical, I'm going to call them narratives, is all about, and how they relate to your own position within an immense and maybe endless possible, or network of possibilities when it comes to historical knowledge as in events, locations, and people. And I'm sure that we can expand on lots of these thoughts maybe in the discussion, but I wanted to sort of go virtual with this and stress some of the points that we've been discussing already, move away from anything that looks like a book into sort of experiencing the construction of knowledge, of historical knowledge, or basically any kind of knowledge in an immersive scenario that is not immersive in a way that it presents a story that I can follow, as in video games or in other historical virtual reality scenarios, but in a immersion in the process of actually creating historical narratives. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Jesse, would you like to come up to the front? Before we open up the question to the audience, would you like to respond to each other's papers briefly?
Is this on?
Yeah.
Oh my God, that was amazing. I'm so excited. That was so cool. That's all I have to say.
Great.
Congrats, Zilka. That's really awesome work.
Great. Are there any questions?
Thank you. This is for Jesse mostly. I just want to discuss a bit your ontology there, because you say that the historian basically constructs the evidence, but that's the authorship. My ontology is somewhat different. I would say historical events are explosions of information. They send signals in all directions. Most of them get lost, get mixed up with noise and so on. Some of them reach the present. And then the innovation of the historian is not to construct the evidence, but rather to discover methods of translating the information that is, as you said, it's not just in archive, it's also in material remains, in looking at the prices of meat in the meat market in London, looking at the shapes of fields, and so on. So it's not construction as much as discovering nested information, and in that respect, historians are information scientists. And then when they create those data sets, what they're doing is basically recovering information signals. The technical challenge would be, how do you make public not just archives, which are printed and then you just scan it, but how do you archive shapes of fields, how do you archive pots, broken pots, and so on. In principle, it's possible, but you can do a 3D dimension scanning of a broken pot. But how do you do that? And then my final point would be what you're suggesting actually is going back to the roots of historiography, because if you look at the way it all started between Göttingen and Tübingen, in the late 18th century, it was all about publishing those data sets. Or the Rankian seminar was about discovering the documents and then publishing it in many, many volumes. So in that respect, it's not that revolutionary.
Thank you. I really appreciate the question because it does absolutely highlight some distinctions or characteristics of what I'm trying to say. So yeah, I understand the view you articulated. I disagree entirely. I don't have any ontology of events. The period that I study, the event is iconoclasm, and everything that I've researched has made that a non-event. So I have no event to study as event is normally conceived. I have little events. I have the writing of a book. I have the election of a patriarch. But the event iconoclasm became non-explanatory, and the material I work with became not a source on iconoclasm, because iconoclasm as such did not exist. So I absolutely hold that we have to deontologize the event and realize that it is constructed, and as constructed it has existence, but that we make it. And as such it can be unmade. And again, I would just reiterate the thesis, like nothing is inherently a source on anything. We make them sources on things. So, you know, the event on a particular date can be the beginning of a war, but for someone else's life it is a birthday, for someone else it is a marriage. These are all historical events, and which one matters is just perspective and construction. What I'm assuming you understand as event, right? So like, which usually, you know, sort of like Danto's like R and R1 and R2, right? These are, right, like what traditionally is conceived of as a historical happening, which is, right, a sort of like something that is experienced by multiple people, and people would give it the same label. So you have a different, you're going for a different idea of event.
There's philosophical literature from Davidson on an event. It's simply a change in time.
Okay.
It's something happened. It's not about significance or construction or all these things that are built over that. And just event, my point was, the historian does not construct something out of pure air. It's not arbitrary. There has to be an information preserved in something, otherwise it's anachronism. If a historian takes an object that did not preserve information from the past, which is what bad historians sometimes do and did, and say this is the basis for my representation of the past, of the event, that's just wrong. You don't take as things are now, because they don't. If you have the perfect sociological account of contemporary Italy, you cannot infer from that the history of the Roman Empire, because Italian society did not preserve reliably information from Rome. You need other things that have higher reliability, that preserved information, like texts, like archaeological digs, and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. And that's not the decision of the historian. That's out there. Either it preserved information or not. The creativity is to find innovative ways to find nested information in things that other people did not see. So when you publish your dissertation about texts that other people read and wrote about before, the innovative part is you probably discovered the information that other people did not see in those texts. That was the innovation. So you discovered evidence, even though materially, physically, things were there before.
Sure. But I decided what it was
It was
information.
not your decision. Either it was
I
there,
decided what the information was on. And I know that because I had that thought process. I had to decide what I was reading information on. And I had to craft the event. And I made the event to be the creation of that manuscript at the time the manuscript was written, which was not how anybody else had read it. That was a non-event prior to my study.
And
So I
had it been
created,
arbitrary, your colleagues would have called you out and said, no, this is a wrong inference. If
no, I think
your
it was a pretty good
colleagues-
inference. So, I mean, we can go back and forth on this, but I fundamentally, we have a fundamental disagreement on this, and we can sort of try and hash it out. But to your second point, I would say, yes. I am absolutely basically just calling for, in the discipline, a re-acceptance, a return to fundamentally archival work, the value of archival work, creating and publishing archives as what I think we should mostly be doing. So yeah.
Great. Maybe this can continue afterwards.
Yeah,
but
and I want to make
because
sure
think
people have
that
time to
there's
ask
another
Zilko
question
questions.
in the chat. No? Okay. Are there other questions? Yes.
Silke, I think your stuff is also awesome. I echo Jesse's, oh my God. But what I'm wondering about is how are you going to train your users to see this as historical inquiry and not something else? Because I think, you know, with new and innovative forms, we do have to consider, and we were talking about the reader before, how do you just train them to use it and understand it as such?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question, and also for the verbal applause. I'm always I'm as excited as you are, because obviously I didn't do anything on the technological side, and I'm very excited to see this actually working. But anyway, I think so. So what we do at the moment is we do lots of user studies where we try to first of all get data on how people actually use our interface and what kinds of decisions they make and why they find different relations, in order to then have basically a tutorial present in this sort of workspace scenario at the beginning that always gives you the possibility to have like a guided tour of our different rooms, as we call them, to make clear why this is sort of taking up on the historical construction process. And I think because I did this as a historian, but I think that lots of other people would find this interesting, even if they're not interested in specifically historical connections of data. Especially if you go to the big data starting set that we have now with the Wikipedia. This is not a good starting point for historical research, really, as most of us know. But so we're in the second project phase. We're actually now digitizing personal archives of people within the LGBTQIA plus community of the 1970s and 80s, and turn this into a specifically historical data set to actually make this more into a historical project. So this is a prototype now that works sort of with a more like, it's not a corpus of data, it's more like a it's Wikipedia, and then sort of turn this with user studies and case studies into a more historical project when we actually feed historical data into into the tool.
Zilka, can you say more about sort of maybe analyzing is the wrong word. I think I may be asking you for like metaphors, actually, because I mean, how are you thinking of what this accomplishes? So to sort of prompt you, you know, to me, you know, looking at that, it's like you've kind of somehow erased the distinction between like prose text and footnotes, even though they're all both there, but they're now sort of equally the text, and sort of the reader is kind of confronted. I mean, I think Shahzad made a sort of point like this earlier, right? The reader is sort of like constantly confronted with the right, the material which lies behind any sort of present representation or factual statement. But could you just like elaborate more on what you think this does for what we count as the text, I suppose is what I'm asking.
Well, I think that being historians, we kind of tend to move back to textual formats, right? So what we're implementing at the moment is that you kind of have the possibility to talk your way through this application. So you kind of comment on what you do and why you make the decision. So when you get out of that open space of endless possibility, you kind of have a track where you went and what were your stations and why did you go left and not right, to kind of give you this point of reflecting on the decisions that you make in the process of discovering knowledge, really turning this back into something that can then turn back into text. Because if people want to use this, it kind of has to have a place within the usual practices how we do what we do. And this is also how I would use this basically in teaching as well, like do seminars, have data sets ready and then sort of observe each other in the process of exploration. Because this is what is exciting about history. You start reading in the archive some kind of, you go somewhere looking for something, and then you find all these other bits of information floating around, and then you try to make relations between those bits of information. And you need, again, a process of documentation, to go back to the to your point, Laura, to make it possible to take this out of the immersive experience and turn this into material that you can then work with. So we're going to have like basically a log date, a log file, sorry, that kind of tracks your movements. And then you have the possibility to actually, do this with a voiceover to take this out of the virtual reality and then work with the kind of decisions that you make. So maybe that is sort of the relation of co-authoring, or actually, authoring something that is then maybe a story when you take it out of your exploration phase. So that's basically the way that we think about it.
Yeah, I didn't realize that you'd also built that sort of self-reflective feature in, which is, again, except for what you're sort of presenting, Laura, that's not something that we have built into our work, is a sort of like immediate feedback loop on what I just did in the archive, right? Which maybe is then sort of implicating on how what I actually spent time doing, or as you're saying, how much did I actually explore and pursue something new? That's really cool.
I think we have time for one last question.
Thank you very much. So this is for Jesse. I mean, it was amazing to listen to your presentation, but one of the questions that kept coming up to my mind, which actually came out in the first question, is who is the we? I mean, clearly we don't actually agree as historians as to what this all is doing. Yeah. So that, how do we deal with that question? But the other thing is that connected to that, when you ended by saying that the difficulty is changing the culture. Mm-hmm. Now, culture sounds too anodyne. Actually, it's not culture, it's power and authority. Yeah. And behind that, the version of history that you're saying we should do, mm-hmm. that has a very distinct politics, which mm-hmm. is embedded in historical realities from the 18th century onwards. Mm-hmm. So how do we process and deal with those politics? Because the implication of what you're saying are radically different depending on where in the world you're located, even to this day. Yeah. So just more reflection.
Yeah, and your ability to access an archive, to create an archive, to publish it. Yeah, I think those politics are already there, right? And we're fooling ourselves if we don't think they are. So part of what I'm wanting is I think, and this is maybe related to what Zilka was just describing, but in a different way, right? This is actually allows the politics of the archive to become more explicit rather than, again, embedded, 3 steps removed from, right? Like, why do I even have access to the manuscripts that I have access to from this 9th century text, right? Like, I didn't even, that's nowhere even near a footnote in my book, right? But this different way of thinking about it, that then becomes a part of the README file at the beginning on, what are the imperializing practices that make the manuscripts that survive from this text written in Constantinople present in England. Right, so yeah, the part of the paper that I wrote for the theme issue, I went back and forth with Courtney a little bit on this, and then some other colleagues who I sent it to, but I wanted to sort of come out explicitly, because my personal view is I don't know how to get away from that and still do the thing that we call history. So I'm not a super big fan of the method I described. I just think it's what the practice is. I think this approach, what I described about our approach to sources, right, is explicitly colonizing, for lack of a better word. I don't know how methodologically we get away from that, but I think it's there, and I think the only way to come up with other ways is by centering the actual method, being honest about it, which I think does have some liberatory possibilities. There will be more people and more archives that we see, and those will change narratives. And then, you know, the hope would be, at that point, we can then take another step towards better. But you're absolutely right that it will remain embedded in the structures of power that currently persist, and I don't have a way of changing those.
Thank you. So please join me in thanking our panelists.